Hey guys, Robbie here from CrossFit South Bend. Today we are going to be talking about an intro to macros with relation to carbs. So this is another part of our ongoing intro to macros series. We did a whole video talking about what are macros in the first place and how should you balance them out. We did a specific video on protein in relation to macros. Now we're going to do a video specifically on carbs, and then we will finish off with a video on fat. So today we're going to be discussing carbs. But again, in this macros context, so we'll be talking, in particular, what people want to know: how much in the way of carbs should you be eating? What kind? We've talked about this a lot more in other videos, but we'll talk about it again today. And then special considerations with relation to things like net carbs, fiber versus sugar, so on and so forth. Okay. So just like we did with protein, let's talk about how much in the way of carbs you can have on a daily basis. Now, the truth of the matter here is that there's a super broad range. Physiologically speaking, you could technically go all the way down to the carnivore diet, which has become popular these days, which is, essentially 0 grams of carbs. And then there are hunter-gatherer societies that, have gotten, even beyond 40% of calories from carbohydrates. But I would say a pretty good broad range for most people, just so we can all get a handle on this and not have it be some crazy ridiculous range, is somewhere between 5% of calories, which is roughly what a ketogenic diet would be, all the way up to 400 grams of calories. Now, as I've mentioned before in many other videos, the standard American eats about 300 to 400 grams of carbs a day, which is insane in that context because of a sedentary lifestyle and the fact that the carbs that they're eating aren't vegetables or fruits. We are talking about, grains and pastas and cereals and, bagels and donuts and things like that. So this is a good broad range for healthy carb consumption. On the low end, someone who's doing keto. On the high end, maybe someone who, is a CrossFit Games athlete or something like that and needs 400 grams of carbs a day. This can range, if you're doing this as a percent of calories, roughly speaking, again, talking about reasonable calorie ranges. Like I said last time, we're not talking about, the mountain from Game of Thrones who competes as a strongman and eats 10,000 calories a day. We're talking about normal physiological amounts for a normal human being. This would be 5% to 40% of calories, roughly speaking. Now, I think a much more helpful range, again, for most people, if you are doing CrossFit here at the gym, just generally working out, just trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle, a more narrow range for most people to focus on is going to be very, very similar, extremely similar, in fact, almost identical to the protein range. So between 100 to 200 grams of protein, depending on activity levels, which we'll be discussing a bit more down here. That's a new consideration with carbohydrates specifically. And again, this is going to be about 20 to 30%. Now, it's going to vary depending on, how many calories you need per day and your activity levels and all these different things. But that's a pretty good place for most people to start. And like I've said before, what matters first is starting with this stuff, getting a good basic level, practicing with that, and then if you want to modulate that or figure out what doesn't work or what does work, you can go from there. But jumping into the deep end of the carnivore diet or the keto diet without first passing through, are you even eating real whole food? Do you even know how to measure calories? Do you even know what a macro is? Isn't necessarily going to be the greatest idea for most people. So I think going through those stages can be very helpful. And this would be one of those stages that I think can be helpful for most people. So somewhere in this range. What does that amount to? Well, roughly, again, depending on how many meals you have per day, 25 to 50 grams of carbs. If you had 3 meals a day with 50 grams, that would get you 150 right in the middle. If you had 4 meals, that would take you 200. If you had 4 meals of 25 grams, it would take you to 100. So it depends on how many meals, but roughly 3 to 4 meals a day, that would take you to where you need to go. Now, a new consideration that we didn't discuss last time with regard to protein, because protein is much less, protein quantity that you would consume is much less dependent on energy expenditure, is energy expenditure. So with carbs, your energy expenditure, how much you're working out, to put it in layman's terms, is a very important consideration when considering carb amount. So a pretty good guide to this, that isn't the end all be all, but is a great place to start, is going to be something like 0.5 gram of carbohydrates per pound of body weight if you are sedentary or very, very lightly active. So if someone weighs 200 pounds and they're not very active, then having about 100 grams of carbs per day is going to be, a good place for them to be. 1 gram of carb is for kind of light, aerobic, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, things of that nature. 1.5, you're getting a bit more active. And then 2 grams of carbs, that's for like your really, really hard workouts. That's for stuff that's really tough and intense. Maybe someone's doing 2-a-days, something like that. But that's a pretty good range for most people. And again, doing the math here, just taking a 200-pound person, just as an example, 200-pound person doing crazy workouts, be getting 2 grams per pound of body weight, all the way up to that 400 grams range. So it just kind of depends what you're doing, but this is a pretty good sliding scale. I'd say for most people who are just working out, 1 gram per pound of body weight. And you will notice, and this is by design, that roughly corresponds to this. Most people weigh most adult humans weigh somewhere between 100 and 200 pounds. There are obviously some exceptions to that on the low end and some exceptions on the high end, but that roughly equates to that. So that's a pretty good starting place for most people. Okay, so that's how much in the way of carbohydrates you should be having. Let's now talk about what